Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Cheryl Williams. I'm the Director of Public Housing for the Louisiana State Office here in Louisiana. Today, myself along with Elvitra Gibbs will be presenting to you regarding public housing programs and processes and virtual disaster resources. Next slide. So over the past 20 years, the types of disasters that we have had here in the state of Louisiana, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and most recently COVID. Hurricanes are more prevalent than the tornadoes or the floods. Flooding generally may come along with hurricanes, but more often than not, when it comes to a natural disaster, it's a hurricane that we have here in Louisiana. We have experienced tornadoes as well. In 2016, we also experienced floods, and that was not only in the southern part of the state where the floods occurred in August, but also in March, the northern part of Louisiana experienced floods. And COVID, which is new to all of us nationally and has affected everyone nationally. So and COVID is a natural disaster in case anyone out there did not know. Next slide. So there are 3 Ps in terms of protecting people and property. So implementation of an agency's disaster plan. So prior to a hurricane transpiring, one of the things that we ask or that we do is send notifications out to housing authorities regarding the disaster. Hurricane season begins June 1st. So come May of this year, we'll start sending notification to housing authorities to let them know that these are about things that they should do to prepare for a disaster. Most agencies have a disaster plan that is in place. Those policies differ by agencies. However, we have asked that all agencies have a disaster plan in place, whether it's to address a hurricane, tornado, or whatever type of disaster there might be. One of the things that we often ask agencies to also do is to secure property, that being the building, hardware that agencies may utilize or need thereafter a disaster, software, and any electronic media. Generally, they're not going to secure every building in terms of the housing units themselves, but they will secure, and this is pre-disaster I'm speaking of, they will secure the office. But if an agency out here does not have a laptop or has not purchased a laptop computer, we encourage you to do so. All agencies receive COVID funds. That's an eligible item with COVID funds that you can utilize to purchase laptops for your staff. And it has helped in many cases for those of us who are working remotely. Hardware, publications, hard copy records. We ask that you secure those items, but we also strongly recommend that you scan those documents, because after a disaster, those are one of the things that, most important things that are lost. So it's important that you scan your documents and be able to have access to them. If you don't scan them, protect them some way such that you're able to access them. Some agencies may, in pre-planning, even ship, those important documents to other agencies where they have an agreement to set up stage to operate after a disaster. So it's important that you protect your records. Next slide. Planning notification. So generally here at HUD, as I said, we send out planning notification. We will be sending out one in May, but we also send out planning notifications throughout the but throughout hurricane season. And I speak here of hurricane season because that's what's most prevalent here to us in Louisiana. So generally, once a hurricane enters the Gulf, we'll send out notifications to Housing Authority regarding preparing, implementing their disaster plan. And a lot of agencies, when it comes to the disaster plan, they will fall to whatever the local community's plan is or whatever the state plan is. But it's important that you have a plan. Notification comes pre-disaster via the media, and that's whether it's television, radio, or social media. Notification is sometimes provided by housing authorities, and we strongly encourage that in many cases, if it's flyers that you all send out, but a lot of folks now are using text messages. So it's important that you have contact information for your residents so that you can notify them or get in contact with them after a disaster has occurred. And if these things are not a part of your plan, or if you don't have a plan, we strongly encourage you to develop a plan and implement it. And it doesn't hurt to do test runs just to determine how it will unfold when a disaster actually happens. For us at HUD, even after a disaster, again, well, let me back up a little bit. We also do phone calls and emails to our housing authorities. So I'll tell you, the week of a disaster, we're on the phone with the agencies, asking them about their plans, if they're in place, if they've activated them, are they being carried out? We send emails, again, and just in terms of resources that are available after a disaster. And that's whether it's in May when we're sending that information, if it's throughout hurricane season. So there are references that are actually provided to housing authorities in terms of resources that are available to them. Once the disaster has actually happened, we again contact our PHAs in the targeted areas just to make sure everyone got through this safely, and any updates that we may receive regarding damage. And it will start the week of. We know in many cases that it may be hard to get in contact with our agencies. However, we still, try to contact them. Generally, if they're in the area, communication is down. If not, we do have personal cell phone numbers to reach out to the parties, and they're probably in contact with local officials or others back there that may be others who are in the disaster area that may be able to give them updates. So as the PHAs receive that information, as well as go on site, that's information that we roll up to headquarters. So we during the disaster, we call agencies on a daily basis, pretty much just to get updates. It can be a little agitating at times, and we understand, but we understand that information changes on a daily basis. So we are feeding that information up to headquarters so that they can understand what is transpiring on the ground. So as it relates to a PHA plan, after the disaster has happened, because they've done all of the flyers or text messages, the notification, letting families know they should get out of the area. And let me say, if there is a mandatory evacuation, we strongly advise that everyone adheres to that mandatory evacuation, PHA staff, as well as the residents. The PHA cannot make any family leave because it is their home, but they strongly encourage families who are in the disaster area to leave and move out of harm's way. We've had instances where families have been left behind. PHAs have encouraged families to leave, and the situations are generally not very good after a hurricane. So that is for health reasons and any other reason, just in terms of the dangers that may be out because of the destruction. We encourage families to leave, everyone to leave. So after the disaster happens, the PHA takes on that responsibility of trying to determine, and again, this may not be immediate, but they take on the responsibility of trying to determine what is actually transpiring. But they do prior to implement their disaster plan, just trying to make certain that families are out of harm's way. Next slide. Next slide. So what do you do after disaster? You here at HUD, and because we're in Louisiana, we try to locate and identify HUD assisted families, but not only HUD assisted families, but this even extends to HUD staff, because we have as well been a part of a disaster. So the same thing that happens with HUD assisted families also happens with HUD staff as well. So, but as it relates to the families and the PHAs, we contact the PHAs, we try to locate or identify where the families are, and that's why it's important to have families' contact information. Unit inspections occur. So the Housing Authority goes out to assess damages at the Housing Authority. That information, once they have determined what the damages are, they provide that information to us. Stabilized units. In some cases, housing authorities may have to board up units, and it has taken place. In some instances, it hasn't, but it's often the best thing to board up the units to keep families out of harm's way, because there are various dangers in a unit. So we encourage PHAs to stabilize units. PHAs meet with insurance companies and adjusters to determine the amount of damage and determine how much money is going to be received after the assessment of those damage, after assessment of the damage, so that repairs can begin, hopefully sooner than later. But sometimes this process can take quite a bit of time because of the amount of damage. And sometimes because housing authorities go back and forth with insurance companies because they disagree on the amount of proceeds that the insurance company may have said the agency is entitled to. Also, PHAs must maintain their financial operations. So they still have staff that they have to pay, as well as things that they have to do after disaster to keep the agency going. Sometimes agencies may be able to set up, and they have set up in the disaster area. However, I will say that generally presents challenges because communication is bad. Infrastructure is down. So some agencies set up outside of the disaster area. There are plans that they have made with neighboring agencies in the state or neighboring states because of relationships that they have. And that's a part of collaboration. That's a part of collaboration. So they may have set up a plan that they're in another state, or it may be another city within that state, that they're running their operations from. Communication is key throughout the disaster process. It's key. Just to be able to talk to whether it's your insurance adjuster, your local officials, your residents, HUD. So it's key that everyone has information because everyone wants to know what's going on. Families are safe, staff are safe, the condition of the housing authority. So having good telephone numbers, email addresses is very important. So please make certain to keep telephone numbers, email addresses up to date. Next slide. And I'll turn this over to Elvitra Gibbs to begin here. Elvitra, are you muted?
I'm sorry, I was. The mission assignment occurs immediately after the disaster is declared by the president. Once declared, then the affected parishes are identified. Those things that Cheryl just indicated are those that occur within the field office itself. The things that we do as an agency with regards to those families is where the mission assignment comes into play. So when the mission assignment is affected, it is a time by which FEMA and HUD enters into their interagency agreement. It is implemented for the purpose of assisting those that are affected, that being the residents, that are HUD-assisted families and non-HUD-assisted families. The implementation of the disaster recovery also entails a team assignment. The team assignment occurs within all federal agencies, and then there is a joint field office that comes together to provide the assistance that's needed for the purpose of those that are affected by the disaster. Next slide, please. Mission deployment is HUD's disaster response. It's the time by which we are deployed to start assisting those that are affected directly by the disaster, identified as the evacuees and those that are affected within the various identified parishes. There's a listing of families that are provided by FEMA and our Red Cross, for which HUD then vets that list to determine if there are any HUD-assisted families within those areas. We provide information to those families that are HUD-assisted families or the PHAs that they are affiliated with. And we also provide that information to the housing authorities so that they would know where their families are. We share information with our federal agencies, that being the disaster partners, American Red Cross, FEMA, DCFS, and of course our PHAs. There's a displaced families report that we share amongst those federal agencies, along with our housing authorities, so that we can assure that those that are HUD-assisted families are being provided the assistance that they are required to receive. In connecting families to housing options, there's disaster housing assistance provided. HUD-assisted families are provided assistance through FEMA and of course through the PHAs. And that assistance comes in the form of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, also known as Section 8, and public housing. And in the instance where there are public housing families, they may need to be provided tenant protection vouchers. There's temporary housing assistance that's provided to HUD-assisted families. which is also in the form of non-congregate housing, which would be in shelters, hotels, etc. There's also the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, known as DHAP, which has not been implemented within the federal naturally disaster declared disasters, since Hurricane Sandy. And it's when HUD determines that there's a need for the DHAP program to be implemented so that they can provide housing assistance to those that are affected by the disaster. Non-HUD assisted families are also provided the assistance by way of FEMA with the individual assistance within the non-congregate houses. American Red Cross is also one of the partners that we provide assistance to the families that are identified within the various shelters. Next slide, please. The disaster preference is one thing that we ask the housing authorities to have within their various administrative plans. And it's an opportunity to provide those that are affected by the disaster options for housing that would not be readily available in the declared areas. So if there's an agency that is not a disaster area that has a disaster preference in place, then those families would be able to obtain some housing within those various areas. It's been somewhat of a challenge getting some housing authorities to adopt that preference, but as we've seen this last year, at any point in time, in any part of the state of Louisiana, a housing authority can be affected by a disaster. And in those instances, it limits the amount of affordable housing available. Next slide, please. Disaster funding. As Cheryl mentioned earlier, there are various opportunities for the housing authority to get some financial assistance. Of course, their first line of funding would be their capital fund, and of course, then their insurance. There's also the Capital Emergency Fund that HUD provides, and in fiscal year 2020, there was $20 million allocated for emergencies and non-presidentially declared disasters. This assistance is on a first-come, first-served basis, and it's expended until all funds are exhausted. It is to address those capital needs that the housing authority has accrued within a disaster. Applications are submitted to HUD, the field office, for review and concurrence to be submitted to HUD headquarters for underwriting. It is very important that the housing authorities that are not within a non-presidentially declared area apply for these funds. Because they are limited, it's also very important that they get that application out as soon as possible. This year, we were able to take advantage of the COVID funds that were made available to assist with some of those issues that most of the agencies experienced as a result of the disaster. So they were allowed to use those CARES funds towards any disaster-related activities. Next slide, please. Coordinated effort. The Housing Authority is one of many in a local community, and catastrophic events require joint efforts of all community organizations working together to overcome its impact. So it's very important that the housing authorities communicate with their local municipality along with the government, and that being state and federal, to ensure that there are plans in place that are in accordance with their local municipalities and or state. Proper coordination with community partners will better align resources to support preparation and planning for disaster recovery. Well, we found this year that it was so very important that we had GOHSEP on the ground with us this time for the disaster that occurred in Lake Charles. So that in itself tells us just how important it is to have those coordinated efforts in place. Next slide. On this slide, there are a number of resources that we provide to our housing authorities, and we also provide to those that are HUD assisted and are non-assisted families, non-HUD assisted families, that is, I'm sorry. That's the Louisiana Division of Emergency Management, FEMA, Louisiana Red Cross. There's a PHA disaster prep guide, and we provide this information to our housing authorities to ensure that they incorporate these things into their disaster plan. There's the PIH 2012-48 notice, which is what I just mentioned about the emergency funds. And there's the disaster specific housing assistance, also known as DHAP. Non-presidentially declared funding assistance application, as I mentioned, is the first come, first served basis. So it's very important that you get that application in as soon as possible. And then there's PIH Notice 2016-18, which is guidance on full flexibility for eligible small PHAs to use funding toward any disaster activities. Next slide. Contact information that's listed here is for both myself and Cheryl Williams. You can contact us at any given time for any information that you might have with regards to the presentation on today. The slide presentation will be provided for your future reference. And of course, you can contact us via email or phone.